Next, we will discuss access. An access cavity will uncover the pulp chamber by removing the entire roof of the chamber and fully exposing the orifices of the canals. It must be designed in such a fashion that all the walls taper from the floor of the chamber to the occlusal surface. It must allow for straight line access to all the canals and for the free, unimpeded movement of the canal instruments. The coronal tooth structure should not interfere with these instruments. If you cannot see the canals, you cannot treat them. For gaining access, the armamentarium is as follows: your basic endodontic setup, your high-speed and low-speed handpieces, the plastic blocks representing the maxillary incisor, the maxillary premolar, maxillary molar, and the mandibular molar. In addition, you will need a number 2, a number 4, a number 6 surgical length burr, both right angle and friction grip. The number 2 is generally used in a mandibular incisor, sometimes in a premolar. The number 4 is generally used for the maxillary anterior teeth as well as premolars. The number 6 is used for the maxillary and mandibular molars. If designed correctly, all access cavities will have some common features. The access cavity will take on the external shape of the tooth. For a central incisor, you could see that it is triangular in nature. The base, or the widest part of the triangle, being at the incisal end, and the apex, or narrowest part of the triangle, at the cingulum end. Another common feature in all access cavities is that the enamel-dentin ratio of the tooth in the cervical area must be maintained. In the cervical area, the enamel is thin and the dentin is thick. And that ratio we want to maintain so that the tooth will not fracture in function. The walls of every access cavity must diverge from each other at all levels of the cavity. The narrowest part of the cavity will be at the floor. The widest part of the cavity will be at the incisal end or the occlusal end of the access cavity. For teaching purposes, we will break the access process into 2 portions. The first being penetration. We penetrate through the enamel, through the dentin, into the roof of the chamber. For an anterior tooth, and a central incisor specifically, the burr is placed at the junction of the lingual plane, as demonstrated in the red here, and the plane of the cingulum. It is positioned in a manner that will keep it parallel to the incisal labial 2/3 of the tooth. So it would be positioned like so. The burr is positioned at the junction of the 2 planes between the marginal ridges and parallel to the labial incisal 2/3. And it is kept in that position throughout the entire procedure. For demonstration purposes, we will be working without water. However, when you're working at your workstations, you will use water. And you will do it over the mannequin's head so that the suction can catch the water. Note, it's kept parallel. It's in the long axis of the tooth. I believe I have gone into the roof of the chamber. So I'm going to check with a Explorer. And lo and behold, the Endo Explorer falls into the little penetration hole in the roof of the chamber. Now that we penetrated through the roof, we go to the next step, which is funneling. And we funnel the walls of the cavity to the height of the incisal edge so that the walls taper from each other. Now the burr is put back into the chamber at the level of the perforation of the roof, and the burr will be brought up in a circumferential manner to the height of the lingual wall. And note, it is still parallel to the labial incisal 2/3 in the lingual surface. The burr is being moved, the handpiece, circumferentially. And this is a properly well-designed access cavity. You have full vision of the orifice to the canal. The instruments, when placed into the canal, can move around freely without contacting the coronal tooth structure. And the ratio of enamel to dentin has been maintained. We will now proceed to the maxillary premolar. Maxillary premolar and all posterior teeth. The long axis of the tooth is in a vertical plane. So the burr is placed in the central fossa, which is the junction of all the cuspal inclines, which would be at this point here. You then penetrate through the roof of the chamber and then funnel back, as we will demonstrate now. The roof has been penetrated, and now I will place my burr just below that penetration, not to the floor of the chamber, and just bring it up to the occlusal height circumferentially. Notice the position of my burr has not changed as I move it around. It's still held in the long axis. Notice you have a full view of both canals. The shape of the axis cavity follows the shape of the tooth. And again, the enamel-dentin ratio has been maintained. This tooth is ready for cleaning and shaping. Also notice that the mesial and distal marginal ridges have been maintained. To gain access, one can use either a slow-speed handpiece or a high-speed handpiece. For this demonstration, we've used high-speed and low-speed. And you will notice that when we use low speed on Ivorine models, we do get a smoother preparation. Therefore, it is recommended that you use slow speed for the Ivorine models or the Ivorine blocks. Use high speed when working on natural teeth. There is a higher risk of perforating the floor of the chamber than with a slow speed handpiece. Therefore, you can use high speed to penetrate the enamel, the dentin, and the roof of the chamber, after which you will switch to a slow speed handpiece to finish up the access cavity. For maxillary and mandibular molars, the principle for gaining access is the same as for any other tooth. The burr is held in the long axis of the tooth in a vertical direction in the central fossa, as one can see here. If done correctly, the burr will be at right angles to the occlusal surface. And there we are, we dropped in. Now we're going to place the burr just below that penetration and bringing it up to the occlusal height of the occlusal surface. And now we place the burr just below that penetration, holding it in the vertical direction, that is in the long axis of the tooth. We remove the roof of the chamber. Make every effort not to bring the burr to the floor of the chamber, because the risk of creating a perforation in the floor is great. Therefore, you will notice that the blue dye on the floor of the chamber will not be removed. That represents the pulp. In a normal tooth, we remove that pulp from the floor of the chamber with a spoon excavator, but we can't do that here. And we've now accomplished a correct access cavity. We have not created any perforations in the floor of the chamber. All the walls taper from each other. There will be freedom of motion with any file that we put into this tooth, into these canals. They will not bind on the walls of the chamber. Now we will proceed to the maxillary molar. For the maxillary molar, as with the mandibular molar, the burr is held in the long axis of the tooth in the central fossa, as so. Continuing with the slow speed handpiece, the burr positioned in the central fossa, we penetrate through the dentin, through the enamel, and into the chamber. Fell into the chamber. Putting the double-ended endodontics explorer in, we find a catch in the roof of the chamber. And we will now place our burr into that perforation and start the funneling process. We will be removing the roof of the chamber and bringing the burr up to the occlusal surface. We move the handpiece circumferentially up to the occlusal surface. Do not stay in one position only. Keep moving the handpiece. Try to avoid drilling on the floor of the chamber for any length of time. If done correctly, the shape of the outline form of the access form will follow the shape of the external surface of the tooth. Notice the access shape is similar to the shape or the external shape of the tooth itself. So here we have the buccal wall of the tooth. The mesial wall of the tooth. If done correctly, the outline form of the access cavity follows the external shape of the tooth. And here too, we have not penetrated the floor of the chamber. All the canals are visible at the same time, and all allow for free movement of the files that will be inserted to clean and shape the canal. Note that the outline of the access cavity follows the external shape of the tooth. All the canals are visible and can be entered freely without being impeded. This is a properly designed and executed access cavity. This is an access cavity that is obviously too small and would not allow for unimpeded movement of the files that would be used to clean and shape this canal. This is an access cavity where penetration of the floor of the chamber occurred. This generally happens when one presses the foot pedal and just lets the burr go indiscriminately. And as you can see, it happened in several spots on the floor of the chamber. This is an access cavity that has multiple errors. From this ledge over here, I could tell that the handpiece was not in the long axis of the tooth, which is parallel to the labial incisal 2/3, which would have been like this. Instead, it was held like this, and the burr went into the wall. Also, it is up too high on the incisal edge. Because of the poor positioning of the burr on the tooth, it was placed too close to the edge of the cingulum. A ledge was created, and it covers part of the entrance into the canal, the orifice to the canal. Also, the poor positioning encroached too much on the marginal ridge. As a result, it is not between the access cavity, is not between the marginal ridges. In this access cavity on the maxillary premolar, the wall was encroached upon, the marginal ridge, thus thinning out this wall and making it more prone to fracturing.